Good afternoon. Welcome to my studio. My name is Robert Amos. Efren has asked me if I'd make a little memoir kind of speech this afternoon to tell you a bit about myself, what I do, how I got here. I look forward to it. I thought I'd begin with the obvious place. Picture of my mother. My mother Marjorie grew up in Toronto. Her father was one of the first civil engineers, had an engineering firm. She was a hard-working woman though, university graduate in household science, and worked as a dietitian in various girls' schools. But when she was at university, she fell in love with my father, Donald Amos, who was also a student at University of Toronto. My father was studying theology, and he shortly became a minister in the United Church of Canada, which is something he did up until his death of most of 90 years. They were wonderful parents. You couldn't ask for better. I was the third of 4 children. I have 2 older brothers, born in 1944 and 1946. I was born in 1950 in Belleville, Ontario, which is on the shores of Lake Ontario. Beautiful old Ontario town. My father was the minister at Bridge Street United Church. My family only lived there for 1 month after I was born, though, and in 1950 moved to Toronto. Here's a picture of me. Maybe 1954. It was rather an idyllic upbringing. My family lived in a neighborhood that was filled with young families, sports, baseball, organized hockey, street hockey down the road, sledding in the park nearby. All of these things were constant in our family. It was a good time. And the best time of all wasn't at home in Toronto, but it was at my family's summer place in Muskoka. My grandfather had the foresight in 1929 to buy a beautiful piece of property on Lake Joseph, 120 miles north of Toronto. At that time, it was going up north for the summer. But nowadays, you can pop up after work in a couple of hours. Times have changed. But for my childhood, it was golden there. We went and spent a month on the lake. This is my painting of the view from the front porch, looking at our neighbor's place, back in the bay where we all learned to swim, and across the lake. Down the lake a mile and a bit to Port Sandfield, just nearby the beautiful hotel called Sherwood Inn. So we had a month there every summer, but it really seemed like forever. And that's what I really thought I'd like to do with my life, have it go on being summer holidays forever. Well, it's not something you can really do in Toronto. You have to do something else. And I did. First of all, I went to Queen's University in Kingston. I spent 2 or 3 years there enjoying the life of a student. First of all, living in residence and scrabbling together for some kind of summer job to keep it together. But mostly it was a beautiful life. First of all, I was studying English and drama. But after a couple of years, I noticed that the people I was hanging out with were spending their time drawing and painting. And that looked like a lot more fun to me. So, after a year hitchhiking around Europe in 1970, I enrolled at York University in Toronto. It's a new university and one just getting a grip on a fine art program there. I spent 2 years and graduated from York University with a degree in fine art, but honestly, what I learned at that place was perhaps not very important in the general scheme of things. What was important, though, were the interesting people I was meeting through that. And living in downtown Toronto, I was in close quarters with an awful lot of artists. At one time, a man named Dana Atchley, who had in fact been a teacher here at UVic and was from Crested Butte, Colorado, came as a visiting teacher to our school. And he certainly put on an interesting show. And after his visiting artist stint, we invited him home, myself and my fellow students, to our place downtown to have dinner. And when he got there, he couldn't believe that we didn't know the people at Coach House Press, just a few blocks away, which is where he was staying. Well, I did get to know the people at the Coach House Press. It's an artists and poets press that made up a living by printing business forms during the daytime and printing poetry all night long. The head of the press, Stan Bevington, was also one of my professors at York University, and he suggested, since the course was in typography, that I could do the course at the Coach House Press downtown. Then he said, "Have you written a book?" Well, I thought, well, a friend of mine, Rago DeBuff, and myself wrote a really crazy book at one rather deranged afternoon, so I decided I'd publish it. And over the course of the year at the Coach House Press, I published my first book. It's called Baron and Rago's famous 14,000 words of divine intervention, brown rice, great Canadian novel. It's, I don't know, the next best thing to Finnegan's Wake. It's pretty complicated. You need somebody who knows to explain it to you. I had a lovely time printing it, though. I learned how to run the printing press, I learned how to run the copy camera, I learned how to set type, and we had the first time ever photo typesetting. How soon we have moved on. This is the days of before computers, you know that. Well, it went on. I spent a lot of time hanging around the press, and it was just a great place to meet artists and find out interesting things to do. A few years later, with them, I published another book called Stabbed to Death with Artificial Respiration. This is an elaborately illustrated comic book which I put together based on a text by a poet named Opal L. Nations, who had provided me with the text and asked if I would illustrate it. There were a lot of other things going on at the press too. I put together a little guidebook to Japan. I'd had the idea, the dream in fact, for some years at that point that I would like to go to Japan. I didn't have the means to get there, I didn't know anybody there, but I just began making initiatives. And this book, which is called The Best of Everything, is actually a cut and paste version of a Japanese phrase book with my own sketches. I thought it might help me learn certain Japanese words, and when I got to Japan, I'd have my own phrase book, which I could help me understand the Japanese language. Just shows you how naive I was. All was not naivety, though. This is a copy of File magazine. You get it, it's based on Life magazine. But File magazine was a lot more than just a fanzine. It was an incredible bit of what? How can I describe it? You see, Dana actually not only introduced me to the Coach House Press, he introduced me to General Idea, whose headquarters were down in the very foot of Yonge Street on the third floor of a rather dilapidated office building. And General Idea was just getting their feet on the ground. Since then, they've gone to be the toast of the Canadian art world in the conceptual era and international art stars. But at this time, they were just about to bring out the first issue of File magazine, which involved a great deal of collage, of what they call cut up or shut up. There were a lot of interesting and amusing diatribes by the members of General Idea, A.A. Bronson, Jorge Zontal, and Felix Parts, as well as, in particular, Michael Morris from the West Coast. And one of the details of File magazine in every issue was something called the Image Bank Request List, by which artists could suggest the subjects of their interest, and this information would be proposed throughout the world by mail art. There was no email, there were no computers, this was correspondence art. And this was a way of putting artists all around the world in touch with each other. And when you think about it, it was the internet before there was the internet. The artists began to get together. They began to fly around the world to become residents in each other's studios and galleries. And from this, the parallel gallery movement began. A way of art making that was not beholden to the marketplace, but one in which the artist seized the control of power. In Toronto, A Space was the place. Victoria soon got open space. And in Vancouver, they came up with an amazing experiment which goes on to this day called the Western Front. It was specifically the members of the Western Front, Eric Metcalf, Glenn Lewis, and Michael Morris, who were visiting in Toronto at Coach House Press and at General Idea, who said to me, "You really ought to come to the West Coast." Well, I didn't need much provoking. I spent a year in Vancouver enjoying myself with my newfound friends and doing artistic things, painting murals, involved in performance art and video, and living on a derelict pier at the foot of Carroll Street, right on the waterfront, right on the water, in fact. It was an amazing year we had there. We went under the name Pier Group, and one of our members, a man who's since become quite an item in Victoria, was J.C. Scott. I'm just going to show you my painting of J.C. in the upper deck at the pier, working on the endless art projects we had. In behind JC you can see a ladder which runs up to one of the rafters in the roof about 40 feet above the water below. We cut a hole in the ceiling of the warehouse and popped a little glass conning tower out over it so that you could go and sit on the indoors but outside on the roof of our fabulous waterfront location. Even at this time, I was painting with the Chinese and Japanese brushes and inks. It was something new to me. But after a year in Vancouver, I really wasn't sure I had found the place. It was a lot of fun, but I didn't know where I wanted to live there, and I didn't know what I wanted to do there. So one day, in a kind of a quandary, I decided I'd go back to Toronto. I bought an old car. But before I drove that car across Canada, I thought I should just give it a test run. I'd heard about Victoria. I'd heard there was a collection of Japanese art at the art gallery, so I came to Victoria in my old car and went to the art gallery. Well, wouldn't you know, the Japanese art was not on display that day. But on that very afternoon, not unlike this beautiful afternoon, I had discovered Victoria. Nobody told me there was such a beautiful place in Canada. I discovered the art gallery, and I know that they have a collection of Japanese art stored in this building somewhere. And I realized that I desperately needed a job, and I thought, I could do this. I could work at this art gallery and not regret getting up every morning. I'd had some work at the Agnes Etherington Art Centre at Queen's University in Kingston some years before, and I was able to convince the director I also knew everything about publishing books and catalogues, and lo and behold, he hired me. Roger Boulet was his name. and I worked for him as his assistant for the next 5 years at the art gallery. And I'll tell you, that really was my education. The opportunity to work with works of art in a first-hand basis and have to make sense of them and explain them to people was very interesting to me. Over the years, I worked through an awful lot of publications, editing other people's and also publishing my own. Some of my very favorites of my own work are this one from the Gallery's Collection series. It's a book on the Gallery's collection of Japanese lacquer, with a subject nobody seemed to know anything about, but the more carefully you look at the beautiful works of art made of lacquer, the more you want to know. Another of my experiences there resulted in the creation of this beautiful book. I can call it beautiful because it did win the Western Canada Museums Association Award for the most beautiful book of the year in 1978. It's called The Calligraphy of Kan Makiko. Kan Makiko is a Japanese woman who came to Victoria at the request of Joan Stanley Baker and was here for 6 weeks. She had an exhibition of her incredible and rather avant-garde calligraphy at the gallery. She did demonstrations on a regular basis, although totally dressed in kimono. Here she was wielding a great brush full of black ink. And also she taught lessons in calligraphy. Although she didn't speak English at all, she had a translator. Oddly enough, the only people who showed up for the lessons were children, with a few possible exceptions, myself among them. And it was a great experience here in Victoria. Finally, the last chapter of my work at the art gallery was to put together a small traveling exhibition called An Introduction to Japanese Art. The curator didn't want to do this because it was a bit simplistic. So I happily took it on, and for 3 months I spent half of every day unwrapping and examining every Japanese artifact in the gallery's collection. That's really what I went to work there to do, and it was very satisfying. Came out with a nice book too. I was able to work with Morris Printers here in town throughout my entire stay. They did all the publishing for us, and they had fantastic designers to work with, and whatever budget we needed, and some really beautiful productions came out of that. It was very stimulating to me. But you know, it wasn't completely satisfying because I hadn't really determined to make museum work my life's work. I was still hanging out with the artists. J.C. Scott, who I mentioned in terms of the peer group, had actually moved to Victoria and taken up a studio at 551.5 Fisgard Street. It's just up above Fantan Cafe, right on Fantan Alley. It has an entranceway onto Fisgard. You can go upstairs. It was a former gambling club, and it had a back stairs exit onto Fantan Alley. Just perfect for a gambling club. This is a drawing by Rachel Berman, who was known at the time as Susan King, of the front door of our place downtown. And we sure had some great times there. It was a place where when an artist came through town, a performer came through town, if they wanted to get an audience and put on a show at the drop of a hat, we could arrange it right there. If you had some musicians who still wanted to get together after hours and raise the roof, that was a great place to do it. That saw the first erotic art show, an exhibition I put on in 1980, which had a long run after that, many years. The April Fool's Erotic Art Show went on in Chinatown. Around that time, too, I discovered, well, I didn't discover, but I got a little closer to my real, true love artistically, which were Japanese prints. I, of course, knew about the old ones from the books, but working at the art gallery, I discovered the prints from the 1930s. It was 1920s, really. There were just 2 or 3 Japanese artists who had studied Western painting and had brought the Western approach to perspective and realism into conjunction with the old traditions of woodblock carving and printing, which were so beautiful in Japan. And for just a few years, between the old world and the new, the best of both was available in these remarkable prints called shinhanga. This is the first one I ever bought. It was a print by an artist named Hasui Kawase. It cost me $100. I had seen it for sale at Lund's auction and passed up the chance to buy it. And 2 weeks later, when I discovered it in Bill Johnson's bookstore, I knew I shouldn't regret it twice. And I bought it from him then and there. Since that time, I've continued to build a collection of Japanese prints right here in Victoria, buying them when I can find them. This one is a print by the other great hero of the field. His name is Yoshida, Hiroshi Yoshida. This picture of the inland sea. Color woodblock print from the early 1920s. Well, I was inspired by these things. I was inspired by them artistically. I just love the way they look. I was inspired by the mood of the whole thing. It's really occurred to me that Victoria and the Southern Island here, the Gulf Islands too, are very like Japan. I was dying to figure out if that was true. If I went and traveled in the inland sea in Japan, would it seem a lot like the Gulf Islands? I had to find out. So I retired at the age of 30. I quit my job. The director was a bit shocked. He said, well, why don't you just take a sabbatical, come back next year, pick up where you left off? I said, no, my plan is to change my life. I'm going out to do something different, and I'm not prepared to plan my return before I've even left. So I went away. I took all the money I had and had saved and traveled to Japan. And you know, I did get to the inland sea. And I did get to some other beautiful places too. I had studied an intensive course in Japanese language at UBC before I went. I had 3 excellent contacts in Japan. One, an American professor of photography. One, the Mr. Nakanishi, who had been the art gallery's primary supplier of Japanese artifacts through Mrs. Pollard and the Pollard collection. And the third, a young Japanese woman who I had met here in Victoria as she was a tourist. So, among other things, she took me into her family's hearth and home. They had a hot spring resort hotel on the west coast of Japan, right by the ocean. She was returning there to give birth to her first child early in 1980, and I arrived in September 1980. And before very long, she took me to the family's home. This is the next village there. And I well remember the day I rode there on a borrowed bicycle with my paint box in the basket on the front and sat and spent the afternoon painting the fish boats at anchor and the old Japanese houses on the seashore. It's funny to look back on it and find that the first places I went to really were steeped in the old Japan, and I took that as normal. But in retrospect, they were actually aberrations. Japan is a much more modern place than the one I found in the first place. It was a beautiful place and very stimulating. I spent 3 months footloose and fancy-free, traveling, staying in Zen temples and staying in apartments and staying in fabulous hotels that people I didn't know put me up in. The hospitality was really exceptional. And my interest in Japanese lacquer took me a long way too. People inevitably said, you're visiting Japan, what is it you're interested in? What is your hope in being here? And I would tell them I was studying Japanese lacquer, urushi, as they might say. And because of that, I was introduced to people in faraway and very remote places. People passed me from hand to villages where the practices of working with Japanese lacquer are carried out, because it is a material which requires great patience to work with. It requires a dust-free atmosphere and a very long time for the material to set up. So I certainly found myself in interesting country villages. I had a lot of good times there. After 3 months, I had to leave the country. It was a visa situation at the time, and I suggested going to Taiwan. My friend, the American professor, Byron Black, said, Taiwan is very square. He said, why don't you come with me? I'm going to Thailand. Now, I couldn't have found Thailand on a map. I had no idea where it was. Byron said, oh, it's just in behind Vietnam. I thought, Vietnam? Didn't they just have a war there? How can I go there? He said, don't worry about a thing. He said, you go on ahead and I'll arrange for somebody to meet you at the airport. And a young Thai man did meet me at the airport, but I was unprepared for the shell shock of arriving in the leading edge of the third world. The sensory environment completely blew my mind in that place. The music and the aromas and the heat and the flavors and the colors were just send me into a swirl. Anyway, I was there in all 2 months on 2 separate trips. This is one of the very first paintings I painted in Thailand. I came away from the hotel he'd arranged for me to stay at and walked up the edge of the Chop Ya River, which is the center of Bangkok. And at one point I came to the edge of a bridge and was looking across to one of the famous temples on the west side of the river. So I sat and painted it. It's a real pleasure. And if you could get this out of the frame, you'd see that one of the people who watched me as I painted this got right to work and wrote the name of the very place I was painting in the unusual and curly Thai script on the back. This is indicative of the fact that every time I stopped to paint, there would be 100 people gathered around to watch. And they would immediately find somebody who spoke English to begin interviewing me to find out what I was interested in. Oh, they say, you're interested in temples. You must come with us. There's a much better one just around the corner. Would you like something to drink? Go and get him something to drink. Have you had lunch yet? Why don't you come to our house and have a rest? It's really nice. This would go on for weeks. Traveling and painting are the most wonderful things to do together, because painting will keep you with your eyes open looking for interesting things, and when you find one, it will cause you to sit down and be still and let the world come to you. Then things begin to happen all around you. Things pick you up and carry you away rather than you seeking them out. You know what it's like. If you hold a camera up to somebody, people get out of the way. You have maybe a 200th of a second. Whereas when you pick up a paintbrush and start to draw, people come close to you. They want to watch, and it happens very slowly. So things go on. Anyway, I had a wonderful time there. In the course of that year, well, I was in Thailand at New Year's, and a girl I'd met in Vancouver at the Western Front, Sarah, had made a plan with me back in Vancouver that she would come to Southeast Asia and join me on this travel. And she flew to Bangkok airport in the middle of the night in January. I often thought, she really took a risk on me. That seems to have worked out because we've been together ever since. Sarah met me there and we continued traveling. We went back to Japan and then back to Thailand for some more of it during that same year. I just want to show you this one item. This is an antique painting from Burma. We were, of course, fascinated by all the wonderful stuff you could buy in the markets, but we could not buy ceramics, we could not buy books, but we did manage to bring home some remarkable paintings. This is a Buddhist religious book with some of the text in the center and pictures of the people at the side. It's probably from the 19th century in Burma. I just love the blue ultramarine effect on the sides. Well, we traveled and we had an amazing time. We painted and drew and ate and sat on buses and met people and just got ourselves stacked right up to the roof line with wonderful experiences to think about and paint pictures of and tell stories about for years to come. When we came back to Canada, it had become obvious to my family, for sure, and all of our friends who knew what they were looking for, that Sarah and I were an item, and we should probably get married. And toward that end, we continued with our traveling, since neither of us had a home or a job, and we went to stay at her family's place in southwest of Britain, a place called Chepstow, where the River Wye enters the Severn estuary across the river from Bristol. Anyway, Chepstow is an ancient town with a spectacular castle overlooking the river in surprisingly good condition, and the main street takes you up to the town wall, and all of the traffic from England to South Wales used to have to go up that hill and one at a time alternate their way through the town wall. When Sarah grew up there, it was a noisy, dirty old place because of this huge amount of diesel traffic stalling and idling up the main street. Since then, of course, they've moved all that traffic elsewhere, and the whole thing now is cobblestone streets and hanging flower baskets. It's really a treat. We've been back many times, and I love being a guest in Britain. Sarah's family live in country towns around and about, and of course when we go and stay with them, they love to take us around the countryside to the stately homes, the little art galleries, the scenic places to paint, pubs, big old farmhouses. It's a great life. But, you know, we couldn't do that forever. We were in Britain 2 months, which concluded with our wedding in November of 1981, and then we came back to Victoria as per plan. And you know what? We had both decided we're just going to be artists. After all, I'd given up my job. The people in Japan couldn't believe it. I'd given up my job, a perfectly good job. Sarah, who was being groomed for graduate school by the professor she was working for at UBC, decided, well, if he's going to be an artist, I'm going to be an artist too. I'm certainly not, I mean, she was drawing and painting, of course, but she certainly wasn't going to spend her time working as a secretary and supporting me while I stayed home and had visions. That wouldn't do. So we came to Victoria and sublet an apartment in Chinatown upstairs from Fantan Gallery, and we had a few months there right away. And Chinatown immediately became the most important subject for me. Because, you know, I was just back from the exotic East, from Japan, from Thailand, from Malaysia, the Philippines. And I thought I'd really take over the exotic in Victoria. It was during the year we were away that they built the fantastic Gate of Harmonious Interest right on our doorstep. And so I got to work on it. This is one of my first productions there. This is a 26 color silkscreen print, which I made by hand at the studio of Andy Sinatz, which was right upstairs from Kwan Lee's on the corner. It wasn't highly successful as a screen print, but it certainly indicated what sort of craziness I was getting up to, how I wanted to do it. Over the next few years, I continued painting Victoria's Chinatown. I just thought it was such a great subject. I really wanted to reach out and take it for my own. I painted hundreds of paintings of Chinatown. This particular one shows Morley's of Hong Kong, which was one of the great old-fashioned Chinese, it's not exactly a department store, but a, merchant enterprise, an emporium, an import store for Chinese people who needed big sacks of rice or jars of pickled eggs, I don't know what. It's a great spot, and I really love the neon sign with the Buddha and the pagoda in neon. Both of them religious symbols. The Wong's, one of those upstairs restaurants where you can go and have a dim sum. It's the whole place seemed very charming to me. It still looks quite a bit the same, but most of the businesses have been completely gutted and replaced with things a little more tourist oriented. At any rate, I was preparing to paint this picture and my doctor came and saw it, and she said, "Oh, that would be so great if it had my car in it." So I went with her Morris Minor, and parked it in the appropriate location and photographed that, and subsequently painted her car in the picture. This, by the way, is not the only copy of this picture. The one she has, which is horizontal and much larger, also has her car in it. Well, when you're married, you really can't live in Chinatown forever, not if you have any self-respect. I mean, it's noisy and dirty and dusty, and the facilities of your studio are primitive at best. And beyond that, there are no grocery stores, no laundromats. Living downtown was a bit of a struggle. So we moved out, and we moved up to Fernwood for a couple of years, and then subsequently to the Cook Street Village. While this was going on, I was really doing my very best to try to create some sort of career as an artist. And I decided, from my experience working in the art gallery, that there was an opportunity in Victoria. In fact, I should show you this picture first, because this is a picture by an artist named Edward Goodall. Goodall was in the previous generation to me. He was born in England and was from a family who had many artists in the family. And he came to Canada, fell in love with Victoria, and began drawing pictures. He was involved in drawing pictures for the Navy and drawing pictures of different Victoria scenes, and they proved to be quite attractive. He put them out as postcards, published calendars. His work came out in booklets. It was all about Victoria. Mostly they have yellow broom, beautiful blue water, the Olympics in Periwinkle. It was a pretty nice place. But this particular one is an original painting of his, which was given to me by Jean Farquhar. It was originally given by the university to her husband, Mr. Farquhar, after whom the auditorium at UVic is named. And he was the president of the university at the time the library was built. So Goodall did this painting of the library. He would do architectural work, he would paint on commission, he had a good sense of the landscape and what people needed around here. I thought, there's a job for somebody. Nobody is even painting Victoria, this remarkable, beautiful place, completely left alone by the artists. I thought, I need a job. That's the job I'm going to take. Edward Goodall's gone. He died. It'll be me. So I set to work on it, and I painted every different kind of thing in the city. I painted things which I thought were historically interesting, but not much longer to be around. In this particular case, I've painted Victoria Foundries. I think it's on maybe Discovery Street. It doesn't look like that now. All of this is gone. But of course, Victoria Foundries was one of the great industries in Victoria when it got started. But I painted every different kind of thing. And I also made quite a name for myself as being somebody who liked to paint on location. For instance, this is a painting of Oak Bay Avenue, which I painted one afternoon. They were having a paint-in in front of the Painted Words, a book and art supply shop on Oak Bay Avenue. And so I set myself up at the corner looking west and painted everything as it went by and talked to the people. I spent a long time talking with these two people and their dog. And just as they were departing, I thought, oh, I should have been painting his portrait. This is Ted Harrison, his wife Nikki, and their dog Maggie. This is the first time I ever painted one of these electric wheelchair scooters that have become so popular now. And here's some young punk cutting across Hampshire on his skateboard. These things, I believe, will be important historical markers in years to come. We'll say, do you remember when people used to have skateboards? Or do you remember the time everybody used to, suddenly we all wore backpacks after years of carrying attaché cases. Everybody's wearing a backpack now. These are, you know, I put the cars in because a few years from now there won't be any cars. People will be driving hovercrafts or personal helicopters, and these things will look like cherished antiques. This is part of a documentary process of painting, which I've been interested in, you know, since Captain Cook came to Nootka in the 1780s. These explorers always brought artists. People who were coming to a new place were always involved with recording and documenting what it was. And just because we have a camera now doesn't mean there's no validity in an artist taking a look at where they are. So I decided I was going to be the person who painted Victoria, and I got right to work on it. Soon we moved to the Cook Street Village, which at the time was a pretty sleepy little place. There were two grocery stores across the street from each other, the Food Country and Oxford Foods. There was the Scottish butcher, there was a hardware store, there was a barber shop, there was Ethel's Cake Shop, where middle-aged ladies in gingham aprons would take loaves of bread off the shelves and pass them out to you and give cookies to the children. It was all very quaint. Things have changed in 30 years of that, but it was a super place to raise the children. Sarah and I have two daughters, Rosie, who was born in 1983, and Emily, who was born in 1985. And really, they grew up in a village, the Cook Street Village. They knew where the shops were, they were known to the shop owners, they went to school just down the street, they got their first jobs after school, working in the pharmacy or the video rental. It was a dandy place to be. And over the time, I painted a lot of paintings of the Cook Street Village too. This was just on the corner of our street. You know, if ever subject matter was necessary, I'd just take my little red wagon out to the corner and set up and paint for the afternoon. And for sure, by the end of the afternoon, something interesting would have happened. Maybe a good painting, maybe a new customer, maybe a good long conversation with somebody. These conversations, too, are an important part of it as well. When I first came back to Victoria, married, in desperate need of any kind of income, my friend J.C. Scott suggested to me that Monday magazine could use an art writer. So all freelance, nothing to lose. So I began contributing short reviews to Monday magazine. They paid 10 cents a word. And I stood to make $35 if it worked out right, payable 2 weeks after publication. You can tell that was important. So I wrote for Monday for a number of years. We had a very good little bullpen of writers. James Kennedy, the best writer on classical music you could imagine, wonderful guy. Rona Murray, herself a very important writer and poet, was writing the reviews at the theater, and there were a couple of others, but we had a very good little team of reviewers there. But one year at Christmas, the editor, Peter Ladner, called me into the office and said, "Merry Christmas, and by the way, the finance department has given us a new model and we're not having any more freelance writing. Thank you." So I stopped. And that might have been the end of that. But a couple of weeks later, with no explanation, I received a telephone call out of the blue from Gordon Bell, who introduced himself as the editor of the Times Colonist, a newspaper I'd never read. And he asked me if I would consider writing on art for the Times Colonist. Well, I hung up the phone. I said to my wife, "Isn't that preposterous? I'd never read that newspaper. What could I?" And she said, "Robert, you're not getting this." She said, "He's offering you to double your pay, and they'll pay you every week. The only reason you're not interested in that newspaper is because you're not in it. So get with the program." So I went in and took the job. And on my way out of the office, I said to Gordon Bell, "Oh, by the way, what is it you've hired me to do?" He said, "Oh, that's okay." He said, "You're to write a column. You're a columnist. It'll come out once a week, have your picture on the top, and you can say anything you like as long as it's not libelous." And I have always understood those to be my orders at the Times Colonist. That's what I've done. Because it's my column, it doesn't really get edited. It's always the subject which I choose. And so be it. Because I'm not ambitious as a writer, I mean, I really don't want to do any more writing, it's a pleasure to work there. Once a week is quite enough. It's not really a strain. And, well, if they pay me more, that's fine. If they give me less space, I don't mind. If they give me a nice color photograph now and then, that's all to the good. Now it's been 27 years. That's 50 weeks a year times 27 years adds up to approaching 1.5 million words in print about the art history of Victoria. Just while we're here on the subject, I'll tell you my philosophy of what I'm doing with the art history in Victoria. You see, the other art writers I read in newspapers and magazines tend to be stuck on a certain plateau. Like, I only write about artists who exhibited in the National Gallery. I only write about artists who get Canada Council grants. I only write about artists whose work can be seen in Toronto and Montreal and possibly Vancouver. I mean, this is an interesting strata, but it's missing most of the content. I decided I would be interested in everything involving the art world in Victoria, no matter whether it's at the Hillside Mall or at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria. It's all interesting because it happens here. And that this is a place I could get a sense of the full picture of what was going on. And it's been a very interesting ride. It gives me a reason to keep in touch with people I have no other reason to call, and ask them questions which might seem impertinent in other circumstances, and to try to arrange my thoughts in a way that I can speak to the general public. With the hope of actually informing or encouraging them to share the enthusiasms I have. It's been pretty interesting. So with the painting and the writing, these things began to come into focus. One day I was asked by Robert Moyes, another writer in town, if he could use some of my drawings to illustrate a book on Victoria he was doing. So the publisher, Bob Tyrrell, came from Orca Books to see me one day, and he took one look around the studio and said, "I get it." He said, "We're supposed to be doing a book on you, aren't we?" I gave him the pictures for Robert Moyes' books, but he had an opening in his catalog that year. Somebody hadn't delivered the book they'd promised, and he offered me a chance to publish if I could have the book ready in 6 weeks. So, within the parameters he offered me, with my wife's help, we created Victoria by Robert Amos, which is a book of pictures, of lots of pictures of Chinatown and the Cook Street Village. Oh, there's that one of my doctor's car in the rain. It was really satisfying. Of course, who wouldn't be gratified to have a book of their own artwork come out? And it sold rather well too. And when the next year came around, Bob Tyrrell called me up from Orca and he said, would it be okay if we reprinted that book? I said to him, if you have the chance to print something, I want to go to work again. I want more than 6 weeks. I'm going to do you the book that it really should have been. So in the next year, with the help of Orca, we published Victoria, Another View by Robert Amos. It's similar in that it is lots of pictures and a few words of my stories of places that go around here. But of course it's vertical, and it's also 100% color, and it's hardcover, makes book lovers happy with beautiful end papers. I really thought I'd gotten to heaven with this one. I did insist that they publish the title of the book in Japanese on the back. I thought Japanese tourists, if they saw a book with the title in Japanese, would love to have it. Unfortunately, they put that on the back cover of the book, and I don't know if anybody noticed. But it was there. Well, I certainly enjoy these book projects. Another one came out a few years later, the last one with Orca, this book called Victoria Sketchbook, which is all about downtown Victoria. It has a map of the downtown area with every location in the book on the map. And there's a little story about each of the locations, which is just... it's not hardcore history, it's just chat about what a curious person might find out about these things I like to paint pictures of. While this was going on too, Orca came to me and said, we have been given a manuscript for a book called No Such Thing as Far Away, and it takes place in Victoria's Chinatown, and we'd like to ask you to illustrate it. Now, as the parent of 2 little children, I have really served my time reading bedtime stories. I know what I like in a bedtime story, and I also know that this is the golden age of children's book illustration. All of the beautiful children's books that ever existed are still here. John Tenniel's illustrations for Alice in Wonderland, Edmund Dulac, Nicola Bailey, all these people are still here with us. So if I was going to do a children's book illustrated, it better be darn good. And I spent a year doing it, and I really worked hard at this book. The paintings were created actual size as they're reproduced in the book. They were all sent to China and scanned and printed with the utmost fidelity. It is a beautiful production. The book is a book about a little boy whose mother runs a second-hand store in Chinatown. He doesn't happen to be Chinese, by the way, but she decides to move to the Cook Street Village, or Fairfield anyway, and he's rather heartbroken and doesn't like the idea of moving house, but eventually he gets over it. School teachers all across the country have told me how much they love this book because it's the only book that's about moving house and about like, I'm going to lose all my friends. It's something that a lot of kids go through, and it's a good thing to have to help them talk about it. That was a real pleasure. I'm sorry to say, though, that the book went out of print almost immediately and has never been reprinted, and people who've got a copy of that should not give them away because you won't get another one. While this was going on, I was cultivating a new way of making a living, and that was to really specialize on painting pictures of people's homes and gardens. I haven't got a picture of the front of anybody's house for you today, although heaven knows I've painted enough driveways and garages and front porches. But I like a rather more creative approach to what's going to be the picture. You know, people call me, sometimes they have big old houses that are getting out of the family, grandparents have dead and gone. Sometimes they have a little house, it's the one they started out in first and they've moved up, but they want to remember it. And I take huge delight in this. Painting the architecture, piece of cake, but the atmosphere, the ambience, and understanding what image will give them the feeling of where they live. That's really my specialty, and it comes with a huge reward if you get it right. People have unveilings, ribbon cuttings, speeches are made, tears are shed, banquets are held, family reunions are called. It's great for me to find my creative work fitting into such an important place in people's families. It is very gratifying. But you know, these two things, working on commission and writing for the newspaper, have really calculated a situation whereby I can't have gallery representation. If I'm criticizing the gallery on Thursday and waiting for them to give me a check for selling my paintings on Friday, I'm just in constant conflict of interest. And galleries really can't deal with commissioned paintings because it involves a huge amount of interpersonal stuff between me and the client, which the galleries have nothing to do with. They really don't earn their 50% when I'm involved in a commissioned project. So I decided, since I had done lots of commissions anyway, I would really concentrate on that and get to know my customers and clients on a one-to-one basis. And knock on wood, I've pretty well always had a commission ahead of me ever since then. You don't get rich doing it, and it takes a lot of time, but I find it a very satisfying use of my skills and abilities as an artist. Rather than sitting here just painting whatever comes into my head and hoping that some unknown audience will feel the same way, I actually know who it's for before I begin. And they've given me money to start with. And then they want me to make sure that I'm as happy as can be, that I'm there at the right time of day and the right time of year, sitting in the right place, and have a glass of lemonade. It's a very good working circumstance. This is a case where when I got to the man's home, I found it was a little house in Fairfield with a garage door and not much else to look at. So he took me inside and gave me a cup of coffee. It was Sunday morning, and I could see by the deck and the garden beyond it that that's where he lives. And so I photographed him in my unusual method of photography. This is before digital photography. So I just took out my plain old ordinary camera with no flash, no tripod, and kept on clicking the shutter until I had completely covered the situation, which was right in front of me. Then I came home with the pictures from London Drugs, all those little envelopes full of snapshots, and laid them down on a piece of cardboard. I pasted them down, and then took out my paints and pencils and so on, and painted in the parts which I was too cheap to photograph. For instance, the floor and the ceiling. And that gave me a good basis to design the picture, to show to the client what it was I had in mind. And when he agreed with this, then I used this as the basis for drawing the painting. Once I had drawn the whole thing, though, and pretty well blocked it into place, I had to take it all back there and set up in his kitchen another Sunday morning so that I could paint the garden, because of course gardens are much more vivid than photography ever delivers. That's my practice. I find it very interesting indeed. Lots of subject matter there. This is one that came up a couple of years ago. The staff at the Royal BC Museum wanted a going away gift to Pauline Rafferty, who had been their CEO for the previous 10 years. So they commissioned a painting by me of the museum, of the front entrance of the museum. This is my photographic study. The painting itself has hundreds of people in the foreground doing all the things that they do down there on Belleville Street. So that was the museum's gift to their outgoing director. I really love it when my artwork, when my abilities are chosen as what has to communicate some really profound feelings among people. Recently, I did a commission for the university's library, celebrating 50 years of UVic's library, and I did a painting of the library seen across the reflecting pool at twilight with the rhododendrons blooming, and again hundreds of people in the courtyard doing everything to do with media, reading books or magazines or headsets or telephones or computers or laptops or talking to one another. It's that hangs in the library now, right over the circulation desk. I think, yeah, now my work is getting into places where a lot of people see it and they'll have their own relationship to it. And I think they will be historically interesting too, because I've lived long enough to see history overtake so much of what I choose to paint. That was the same year I was the artist in residence at the Empress Hotel for 8 months, and they commissioned a painting of the view from the hotel looking into the harbor on a summer evening, and it hangs right over the porter's desk, right inside the front entrance to the hotel. I think, yes, now I'm getting my pictures in the right places. Part 2, welcome back. So more to tell, all those paintings, all that writing in the newspaper, things just kept on stacking up. As I go along, there's more and more. That type of photography I've just been describing, I found very useful when I went to interview artists. I felt I should get more than just what I could write in the newspaper. It's such a short number of words. So I began photographing artists in their studios. Because as an artist myself, it's an open book. When I see their working situation, I know what I'm looking at. So I began making a collection of photographs of artist studios, and eventually they were featured as a series in the newspaper, a 12-part series, and the publisher Touchwood Editions, which had just arrived in Victoria, contacted me and said, how about a book of the artist studios? So we did, and it has the studios of 33 of the most interesting artists of this region, with my stories about going to visit them, and photographs of their workplace. That was a lot of fun, and it subsequently was an exhibition at the University of Victoria's Maltwood Museum. I made enlargements of the photo collages of the studios and got choice works of art by each of the artists, including E.J. Hughes, Fenwick Lansdowne, Emily Carr, Robert Bateman, and on, Godfrey Stevens, Peggy Packard, Martin Shadley. That was really satisfying to me to see that exhibition come into play. At the same time, another project had been going on. Every issue of the Chinatown newsletter has had one of my drawings on the cover. It's edited by my friend Kalisa Wong, who is a partner in a lot of painting projects. And this is a magazine published entirely in Chinese by the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association here. And after I had given her all the drawings I had of Chinatown, then I started creating new ones for this magazine. And after I had drawn the outside of every building in Chinatown, I began to go to the insides of the buildings. First of all, the shrine and altar in the Chinese public school, and then at the Tamgong Temple, and then on and on. We went and photographed these places so that I could do the drawings for her magazines. Just to show you what sort of thing I have in mind. There's the outside of the Lee Association on Fisgard Street. This is the name of the Lee Association as they spell it on their plaque. This is Jack Lee and another man who were my informants in doing the interviews, and inside is a good detailed look at what their shrine and altar are like, with more detail about who is being worshipped and what the different artifacts are like and the history of the association. Well, once I had done the photographs, it became clear it should be a book, because my approach to doing the photography was to do it comprehensive. I wanted every single member organization, and I did get them in the end. It was 12 years in the making. The newspaper published a series of 12 feature stories in honor of Victoria's, are we at 150th anniversary? And Touchwood said they would like to do the book on the subject. I made them give me 2 more years to produce the book, because this book is all in Chinese as well as English, and it was very important to me that it be accurate and that it be respectful. You don't want to make a mistake in this one, and it really worked out. The book was awarded the Award of Distinction by BC Heritage in that year. It's a real pleasure to work on these things, you know. Refer to my notes. As well as that kind of Chinatown history, I've been working on art historical subjects. Back in the 1970s, when I was working at the art gallery, the estate of Harold Mortimer Lamb and his wife Vera was given to the gallery, and I sensed a very interesting story in those people's lives. And subsequently, I slowly researched it. I interviewed everybody who knew about the subject. I discovered where the papers and the photographs were and read through them many times. And once I had everything prepared, I waited. I waited for the art gallery to hire a director I thought would really understand my goals in doing this show, which is a show about the history of the art gallery of Greater Victoria, as well as many other things. When they hired John Tupper a few years ago, I knew I'd met the man, and I proposed the idea to him, and he accepted that. And subsequently, I went to Touchwood Editions, the publisher, and began telling them the story of Harold Mortimer Lamb and how they were going to have to publish a beautiful picture book telling his story. The art gallery agreed to host the exhibition. And in this past year, over 3 months, between November and February, Harold Mortimer Lamb, the art lover, was seen to considerable acclaim, and the book was published as well. But that wasn't all last year. Harold Mortimer Lamb's granddaughter, Annie Scoons, is quite a charming and wonderful writer, recently moved to Victoria from North Saanich, and our publisher suggested she and I work together. And we did a book called Hometown. It has more than 100 of my paintings in it, most of them created especially for this book. And Annie's stories about discovering all the different Victoria neighborhoods. Quite a charming read, and the bestseller of anything I've ever been associated with. It's well into its 2nd printing already. Oh yes, writing books, eh? Just gotta love doing that. But painting is much more fun than writing. I've been painting in some different styles, and perhaps you just follow me around the room here, and I'm going to show you a couple. This painting here thank you. This painting here is somewhat Chinese in its techniques and in its intentions. It's painted with brush and ink and built up with watercolors and subsequently finished with a little bit of tempera paint. The rocks and water really are the basis of Chinese landscape, and I'm somewhat influenced by how they do it, but really this is out of my own imagination and my own experience canoeing in white water and rivers flowing north out of Canada. It's a lot of pleasure making up these landscapes and painting in this way. I'll ask you to swivel around here a bit. And this is another painting of mine, less of the Chinese inspiration, although the ink, the brushwork, maybe the color scheme, the theme in general, have some sympathy with what Chinese painters like to do, but it's more inspired by the paintings of contemporary artists from China, in particular C.C. Wang. I love painting this way. You know, I studied for a year with Jack Wise when I was at the art gallery. I got them to give me Thursday off every week, and I was a student at the Victoria College of Art, first with Jack Wise. It was very inspiring to lead me to this type of painting. And as I was continuing with this type of painting, I really had a feeling that the paintings needed something written on them. They always need inscriptions and they need red seals. And because the Chinese paintings were written all over in Chinese, I was not able to come to terms with what I should be writing on my paintings. And I tried all sorts of things. I tried song lyrics, I tried poetry, I tried my own writing, and none of this was of interest to me. And then one day I short-circuited my constant interest in the writing of James Joyce with these pictures I was making and found just what I wanted. In fact, in short order, the writing of the words took over from the pictures and became an end in itself. This is one here, and the stellas were shinings, and the earth night strewed aromatos. This is a little text from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. First of all, I put smoke rising from the bottom of the page up into the night sky at the top with stars, and then over top of that inscribed an appropriate text. And subsequently I've been working on it with seals, which I've carved myself out of stone, and in this case a gold and palladian leaf to give it a little extra color. This is one of easily 1,000 pieces of calligraphy which I've created over the last few years, most of it having to do with James Joyce. In fact, as you pan along the wall a bit, you'll see a set of 3 scrolls which show Joyce at different stages of his career with relevant quotations from books he wrote at that time. These scrolls were mounted for me in China by a woman who was an exchange teacher of English there, who asked her students to help her do the picture mounting for me. If you've got the wherewithal to swing around, we'll just take a look at the last section here. These are some I'm particularly proud of. These are 4 panels of calligraphy, one from excuse me, one from each of Joyce's famous books. This is Dubliners, the snow coming down, the last words of the short story called The Dead. This one is from Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and shows twilight fading out of the clouds over the bay at Dublin. This one is from Ulysses and explains what Leopold Bloom found when he and Stephen Dedalus stepped out behind his house to have a pee in the middle of the night. And finally, the first words of Finnegan's Wake, river run past Eve and Adam's. From swerve of shore to bend of bay brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Hoath Castle and environs. You probably don't need to know it, but over the course of the last few years I've written out the entirety of Finnegan's Wake by hand in short lines with a fountain pen. That took 2.5 years. And I've also made 2 entire spoken word recordings of it, most recently in a professional recording studio over the course of 6 years. It's a 75-hour spoken word recording. It's the only spoken word recording of Finnegan's Wake that exists. I hope someday someone will discover and publish it. It took years of waiting for someone to show up who would arrange to have my paintings mounted as scrolls. And while I was waiting, I went to the Moss Street Market one day and I made the acquaintance of a potter named Harumi Ota, a Japanese potter at the Moss Street Market. I thought, I've got to meet this man. And I had a good conversation with him. I followed him home. I interviewed him for the newspaper. Found out he was extraordinarily talented with a very long tradition, which he was the heir to, of the Kutani pottery in Japan. And I told him that I had always dreamed of living next door to a potter. I don't want to make pottery, but I thought I could really decorate the stuff. I love it in museums to see the beautiful blue and white pottery, and I admire the brushwork that went into it. That's what I want to do. He said, I can make this easy for you. And he did. And over the last 6 years, I've decorated about 250 pieces of porcelain, which Harumi provides for me. These are very high-fired porcelain. He provides them bisque-fired, and I have been decorating them with cobalt oxides, which fire right into the body of the ware, and then they're glazed over top. So he does all the clay work and the firing, and it's up to me to figure out what I want to decorate them with. In this case, this is Rembrandt's wife Saskia, who is playing the role of Anna Livia Plurabella in the Finnegan's Wake. And because Finnegan's Wake is a book about Ireland, I've put the Celtic knotwork all around the outside edge. But I needn't be restricted to James Joyce. This particular one has a copy of Tenniel's illustration for Alice in Wonderland, the White Rabbit. And on the outside of it is a pattern I copied from a piece of Maiolica, Italian pottery of about 400 years ago in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford during my honeymoon. As I went on with these pieces, I say I've decorated somewhat more than 400 of them, it suddenly occurred to me that I actually know how to paint pictures, and I could paint pictures of things on them. So this one has a picture of Trial Island and is one of the first of a series of paintings of Victoria which occur on these, and it has the crashing waves on the outside to go along with the lighthouse motif. I've just sent a batch of 50 more pieces off to Harumi's kiln to be fired and can't wait to get them back. Well, I waited and Harumi took a year off, and marvelously it was coincident with David Peacock's opening the new Peacock Billiards downtown. And David also opened the James Joyce Bistro in Peacock Billiards. David is the only other person I have to talk about James Joyce here. And David commissioned me to do the interior of the restaurant. And eventually it ended up to being 8 murals, 16 tables, 2 bars, each of which are 14 feet long, and a variety of other odds and ends, which it's a remarkable installation. It may be the ultimate artistic installation of my life, I don't know. It's hard to explain to people. It's at Douglas and View Street, it's downstairs, it's in the finest pool hall in the Western world, and it's a formerly high-class restaurant. Now they don't bother so much in the kitchen, but all of the James Joyce Bistro furniture is there for a look in. It's kind of interesting from an artistic point of view, but if James Joyce is your literary fetish, this place is a great shrine and altar for the new religion. You should discover it. This one is a little teacup with engraving copied from William Blake, "The traveller hasteth in the evening." A lot of William Blake coming up in my next batch of pottery. Well, have I exhausted you yet? Because I'm really not finished. I just want to bring this to some kind of conclusion for the moment. The big new project, which has really engaged me in the last 3 years, is my relationship with the University of Victoria's Special Collections. Their university library is also the Special Collections and Archives. It's not the university's art collections, that's separate. This is one where they collect papers of things. And when I met the head librarian a few years ago, she told me that the subjects they were interested in, among others, they were anarchists, transgenders, very big archives, but also to become the artist's archive of this region, and Chinatown. Well, I had a lot to share with her. First of all, I started handing over the Chinatown material and the artists in their studios material, and after a couple of years they bought all the original photo collages for both of those books because it's right up their alley. But there was so much more. I said to Lara Wilson, the chief librarian, that I would dearly love it if they would copy all of the newspaper articles I'd written for the Times Colonist, because at the moment they're lost. You can't really find them and research them. And yet I've interviewed all of the artists around here and had my say about thousands of art shows. And so now they are years into a project to scan in an optically readable form every word that came out in the Times Colonist. So my work is not lost. Once they got engaged with that, I said to them, here's another project. I have saved the invitations to every art show I've been invited to in Victoria, full color photographs of thousands of art shows. I said, I'm not selecting them. These are all of them which were advertised. And I've saved them all in alphabetical order, in boxes. Well, they were very pleased to get those, because ephemera is hard to come by. By then I really had their attention, and we started to go on other projects. I started to suggest to them artists who they may not know about, who they should be collecting, and then I was able to go and find whether the papers existed and what levers would have to be pushed to get the papers deposited at the university's archives. This is the basis for research and understanding and exhibiting of artists who I think are giants in this region, but as so very little art history is ever done locally, they could vanish without a trace. In particular, I was first alerted to it when Nicholas Tueli did the work on Jack Wise, and his archives arrived there. As Jack was my most influential teacher, that was interesting. Then they got Ted Harrison's papers, and I was hired to go through the papers and organize them and catalog them and index them so that future people could do some sensible research without having to begin at the beginning. Then I brought to their attention the papers of Margaret Peterson, who I think is a giant among artists in this region. She died in the late 1990s. Her work was just stuffed in a corner and waiting to be discovered, and it was given to the university archives, and I spent last year reading through more than 10,000 pages of manuscript, 200 original paintings, all of her photographs, both artistic and personal, her letters, most interesting. The manuscripts of 5 different books she wrote, none of them ever even near being published. So anyway, I find my work with the history of this place constantly inspiring, not only because it's stimulating mentally, but as an artist myself, I'm finding techniques and attitudes which I can immediately bring home and put to work in my own practice. Well, I hope you'll have a look around. You can just do it while I'm talking and saying goodbye to you, and the pictures will appear on the screen of what's going on in my studio. In our beautiful new home, my wife has designed and supervised the construction of our beautiful new home in Oak Bay, where new chapters of this artistic project are imminent and ready to be launched on the world. Thanks for your attention. Good afternoon.